The first week of Ravi's new life passed like a dream he couldn't quite believe belonged to him. From the cold, cramped walls of his dingy apartment to the polished marble floors of Margaret's mansion, the contrast was dizzying. Each morning he awoke to sunlight pouring in through enormous windows, the scent of roses drifting in from the manicured gardens, and a breakfast table so lavish it felt almost obscene to him. He no longer had to rush out to classes on an empty stomach, no longer counted coins at the cashier to make sure he could afford lunch. Instead, servants attended to him, offering him freshly pressed suits, polished shoes, and a life of comfort he had never even dared to imagine. And yet, behind the luxury, Ravi could not shake the unease that settled over him. He was grateful for Margaret's kindness, for the roof over his head and the security she had given him, but at night when the mansion grew quiet, a silence too heavy to bear wrapped around him. Sharing a bed with a woman almost half a century older felt strange in ways he couldn't put into words. Margaret was tender, almost motherly in the way she cared for him, asking if he'd eaten, if he was warm, if he needed anything at all. Her affection was undeniable, but it was different from the closeness he had imagined marriage to bring. Outside their private world, whispers began to sting his ears. When he walked into town, he could feel the eyes on him, hear the snickers and mocking laughter that followed in hushed tones. Old friends from university avoided him now, muttering that he had traded youth and dignity for comfort and wealth. Even within the mansion, not all was warm. The staff eyed him carefully, some bowing with polite disdain, others smirking as if to remind him he was nothing more than an opportunist in their eyes. He felt surrounded, as though he had stepped into a gilded cage, beautiful, yes, but inescapable. On the seventh night, unease grew into suspicion. Margaret excused herself after dinner, saying she had work to finish in her study. Hours passed, and when she didn't emerge, curiosity tugged at Ravi. He wandered through the quiet corridors until he reached the half-open door of her study. Inside, the warm glow of a lamp lit her figure hunched over a desk, papers spread out like a sea of secrets. He stepped closer, drawn in by the sight. There were contracts, financial statements, and property deeds stacked neatly. But what froze him was the folder near the edge of the desk. His own name was stamped across the top. He leaned closer, heart pounding, and saw pages filled with details of his life, his grades, the jobs he had worked, even his family history back in his village. It was as if she had known everything about him long before their first conversation in the cafe. Before he could pull away, Margaret's eyes lifted from the desk and locked onto his. A small smile curled her lips, calm and deliberate. Ravi barely slept that night, his mind swirling with the weight of what he had discovered. Morning came, and Margaret sat across from him at the breakfast table, sipping her tea with the same calm elegance as always. He could not bring himself to touch his food, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for an explanation. It was she who broke the silence. "You wonder why I knew so much about you," she said gently, as though she had been reading his thoughts. "I have lived long enough to understand that trust is not given freely, it must be tested. You intrigued me, Ravi. Not because you were poor, but because, despite your poverty, you had dignity. That is rare." Her words unsettled him. He wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or manipulated. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze sharper now, carrying the weight of authority. "I chose you because you are not like the others who circle me like vultures. They want my fortune, my empire, but they lack the humility to guard it. You, Ravi, are different. I don't want a lover, I want a partner." The days that followed were nothing like the week before. Margaret began to pull Ravi into her world, a world that was as vast as it was intimidating. She invited him to sit beside her during business calls, had him read contracts, and explained the art of negotiation as though she were a teacher and he her only student. He watched her transform from the gentle woman who asked if he'd eaten enough to a shrewd strategist who could silence a room with a single sentence. At first, Ravi felt overwhelmed, like a child trying to keep pace with a storm. But gradually, he began to understand the rhythm of her decisions. He noticed how she paused before agreeing to a deal, how she left silence hanging just long enough for the other party to falter. She was brilliant, and he found himself learning more from her in a week than he had in years of school. Still, doubt lingered. Was he truly chosen because of his character, or had Margaret seen him as a blank canvas, someone she could mold into her successor? And with every passing day, the weight of her expectations grew heavier. He was no longer just a poor student with simple dreams, he was being pushed into a world where one misstep could cost fortunes, even lives. What troubled him most was not Margaret, but those around her. Her nephews and nieces, her so-called family, looked at Ravi with undisguised hatred. They whispered in corners, glared when Margaret praised him, and made no effort to hide their disdain. One evening, as he returned to his room, he found a folded note slipped under the door. In neat, threatening script, it read, "Leave her, or else." Ravi's hands trembled as he held the paper, a chill running down his spine. He finally understood. This marriage was not a refuge from struggle, but the beginning of a battle he never asked to fight. The tension that had been simmering finally erupted one evening when Margaret summoned her family to the mansion. Ravi sat stiffly beside her at the long dining table, the chandeliers casting golden light over faces twisted with suspicion and resentment. The air was thick with unspoken words, the scrape of cutlery loud in the silence. Margaret, calm as ever, set down her glass of wine and rose to her feet. "I have gathered you all here," she began, her voice firm yet elegant, "to put an end to the rumors, the whispers, and the hostility that has poisoned this house." Her gaze swept across the table, lingering on each relative who avoided her eyes. Ravi felt the tension coil tighter with every second. Her nephew was the first to break. "You've lost your senses, Margaret. Marrying this boy, he's young enough to be your grandson. He's here for your money, and we all know it." Others nodded, muttering their agreement, their eyes darting toward Ravi with contempt. He swallowed hard, his hands clenched in his lap, resisting the urge to defend himself. But Margaret did not flinch. Instead, she smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that silenced the room. "You think you know me after all these years," she said softly, "but you know nothing of the decisions I make or why I make them. You think Ravi is a parasite. You are wrong." She turned toward him, her eyes filled with something between pride and determination. "This young man has what none of you possess: humility, patience, and the strength to rise without destroying others in the process. He has lived with nothing, yet still carried himself with dignity. That is why I chose him. And tonight, I will make my decision final." Gasps rippled through the room as she produced a folder from the table beside her and opened it with deliberate care. "From this day forward," she announced, "Ravi is not only my husband but my appointed successor. Every asset, every company, every share I own will, in time, pass into his hands." Chaos erupted instantly. Voices rose in protest, chairs scraped back as her relative stood, some shouting, others on the verge of tears. One niece slammed her palm on the table, screaming about betrayal. The nephew's face turned red as he pointed an accusing finger at Ravi. "He bewitched you. This is madness." But Margaret raised her hand, and the noise died down like a storm cut short. "Enough. My word is final. Those who cannot accept it will have no place here." The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Ravi sat frozen, unable to breathe, his eyes locked on the document Margaret placed before him. His name, written in black ink, stood boldly where once he had never imagined it could be. In just 7 days, he had gone from a penniless student to the heir of an empire beyond his comprehension. And as Margaret's hand closed over his, steady and unshaking, Ravi realized his life had changed forever in ways he had never asked for, and could never escape. The mansion grew quieter in the days after Margaret's announcement, but it was not the peace Ravi had hoped for. Silence now carried the weight of resentment. The relatives who once filled the halls with forced politeness stopped visiting altogether, leaving only their lingering glares in memory. The staff moved with sharper steps, their bows shorter, their voices colder. Ravi could feel the change pressing against him like a shadow that stretched farther with each passing day. Margaret, however, seemed untouched. She continued with her routines, her meetings, her calm explanations at the breakfast table. She guided Ravi through business reports, placing him in the center of discussions with men twice his age. She was grooming him, shaping him into something he had never imagined himself to be. And though he absorbed her lessons, part of him longed for the simplicity he had lost, days of late-night studying, cheap noodles, and dreams that felt like his own. But it was too late for simplicity. At night, he often replayed the moment Margaret declared him her heir, the uproar, the looks of hatred he had received. The note slipped under his door haunted him too, though he hadn't told Margaret about it. He didn't want her to think he was weak. Still, he could not shake the thought that someone, maybe more than one, would stop at nothing to see him gone. One evening, as he crossed the garden alone, he heard footsteps behind him. They were too quick, too deliberate. He turned, but the path was empty. His pulse quickened, his hands damp with sweat. He walked faster, only to hear the faint rustle again, as though someone wanted him to know he wasn't safe. When he finally reached the mansion's doors, the butler greeted him with his usual stiff expression, and Ravi wondered if the sound had been real or if his mind was beginning to play tricks on him. Later that night, Margaret entered his study. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're restless," she said, her tone not accusatory but certain. Ravi tried to hide it, but she went on. "Power is a strange burden, Ravi. It gives you everything and takes away the peace you once had. But if you wish to carry it, you must accept the enemies it brings." He met her gaze, searching for some sign of warmth beyond her composure. "And if I don't wish to carry it?" he asked quietly. Margaret walked closer, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. "Then it will crush you." Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room. Ravi stared at the papers before him, his name written across documents that bound him to a future he wasn't sure he wanted. The life he had stumbled into felt less like a gift and more like a test, one that demanded more than he ever thought he had to give. And as the night deepened around him, Ravi realized the true weight of his choice was only just beginning. Ravi woke to the sound of rain tapping against the mansion's tall windows, the gray morning sky casting long shadows across the room. The storm outside seemed to echo the unrest inside him. Days had passed since Margaret's warning, but her words still haunted him. "If you don't wish to carry it, it will crush you." He thought about them each time he walked through the endless corridors, each time he sat at her side during meetings, each time he saw the staff's wary glances. It was as if the mansion itself was testing him, measuring whether he was strong enough to belong. Margaret remained steady, unaffected by the currents swirling around them. She spoke little about the hostility from her family, but Ravi could sense she was watching him closely, weighing his reactions. At breakfast, she slid a newspaper across the table. The headline read of a hostile bid for one of her companies, a maneuver orchestrated by someone within her own bloodline. Ravi's stomach tightened. "They're not stopping," he murmured. "They never will," Margaret replied calmly, stirring her tea. "That's the truth about power, Ravi. It doesn't just invite envy, it breeds it." That night, Ravi found himself wandering the halls again, restless. He stopped near the grand staircase when he heard voices drifting from the parlor. He moved quietly, careful not to be noticed, and listened from the shadows. Two staff members spoke in low tones, their words sharp with malice. "He doesn't belong here," one muttered. "A boy like him, what does he know of running an empire? When she's gone, he'll ruin everything. Unless," the other whispered, "someone makes sure he doesn't last that long." Ravi's chest tightened. He stepped back, heart pounding, careful not to let the floor creak beneath him. He returned to his room, shutting the door softly, his breath unsteady. It was no longer whispers or notes, it was open resentment, now shared even among the people who lived and worked in the mansion. For the first time, Ravi wondered if Margaret knew the extent of the danger. He considered telling her, but something inside him held back. Was this another test? Did she want to see if he could endure the pressure on his own? He lay awake for hours, listening to the storm, the occasional clap of thunder shaking the glass panes. When morning came, Ravi stared at his reflection in the mirror. He no longer saw the timid student who had once struggled to afford a meal. His eyes were sharper now, shadowed with unease, but also with something else, a flicker of resolve. Margaret had dragged him into this world, but whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. And as the storm outside began to fade into a fragile calm, Ravi understood with a chilling clarity that the true battle for survival was only just beginning. The following week unfolded under a strange, heavy stillness, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. Ravi moved through its gilded halls with measured steps, careful not to reveal how unsettled he truly felt. Every face he passed seemed to hold a secret, every servant's glance lingered too long, every polite smile carried a flicker of disdain. The note, the whispers, the conversation he had overheard, they weren't just warnings anymore. They were proof that danger lived in the very walls around him. Margaret, however, carried on as though none of it touched her. She was as composed as ever, her voice steady in meetings, her advice precise and sharp. Yet Ravi noticed subtle changes. Her walks had grown slower, her hands trembled slightly when she signed documents. She was still the formidable woman who commanded empires, but behind closed doors, time was beginning to reveal its grip. It was in those quiet moments Ravi realized why she had chosen him. He wasn't merely her husband, he was her shield, her gamble against the vultures waiting for her fall. One evening, she summoned him into the study. Papers lay scattered across the desk, but it was the small velvet box she pushed toward him that caught his eye. Inside lay an old signet ring, heavy and engraved with her family crest. "This," she said, her voice low but firm, "was my husband's. He wore it when he built his first company. I am giving it to you now. Not as a token of marriage, but as a seal of authority. With it, no one can claim you are an outsider." Ravi slipped the ring onto his finger, its weight unfamiliar yet strangely fitting. He looked up at Margaret, searching her expression for reassurance, but her eyes were unreadable. "They won't accept me," he admitted. "No matter what I wear, no matter what papers you sign, they'll always see me as the boy who came from nothing." Margaret leaned back in her chair, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then you must give them no choice. Power is not given, it is taken. You must learn that now, before it's too late." Later that night, Ravi walked through the gardens, the cool air brushing against his face. The mansion loomed behind him, its lights glowing like watchful eyes in the dark. He turned the ring on his finger again and again, the metal pressing into his skin as if reminding him of the burden it carried. He thought of his old life, of books stacked on a wobbly desk, of long nights spent studying under dim lights, of dreams that once seemed so simple. That boy felt like a ghost now, someone he could never return to. As he stood beneath the swaying trees, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, he realized that every step forward would pull him deeper into a world where loyalty was fragile, enemies were invisible, and survival meant becoming someone he no longer recognized. And in that lonely moment, Ravi understood he was already too far in to turn back.